They say grief comes in waves, that it knocks the wind out of you, drags you under, then spits you out just long enough to catch a breath before the next one crashes down. But when my son told me to find somewhere else to fade, I didn't drown. I ignited. 3 weeks after Thomas Carter's funeral, I stood on the porch of the house I had called home for 42 years, clutching a weather-beaten suitcase and a cardigan that still smelled faintly of his cologne. My son, Brian, stood beside me, car keys in one hand and a look in his eyes I had never seen before. Cold, flat. Like I was an item on a to-do list he couldn't wait to check off. "We just can't keep doing this, Mom," he said. "The house is too big. You'll be safer in a community where they have—" He searched for the word, like a man trying to feign compassion, resources. Samantha, his wife, didn't bother pretending. She stood behind him on the threshold, arms crossed, mouth tight. "There's a place in Glendale," she added. "Affordable. No stairs. They even have bingo on Thursdays." A flicker of amusement might have crossed her face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. What struck me then wasn't that my only child wanted me out of the home I'd built, maintained, and poured my life into. It was how seamlessly he could disguise selfishness as concern. How naturally Samantha chimed in, like the lines had been rehearsed. Maybe they had been. When Thomas died of a heart attack on a mild spring morning, I thought the world had come to a halt. I didn't know it had merely tilted, and I was the one being edged off. Grief had left me numb, fogged over like the inside of a winter windshield. I had assumed Brian would let me find my footing. Instead, he gave me an eviction deadline. The day they helped me pack, Brian avoided eye contact. Samantha folded my clothes into vacuum-sealed bags like she was handling used linens from a hotel stay. "You'll thank us one day," Brian said, carrying a box of my keepsakes labeled Miscellaneous Sentimental in Sharpie. "It's not healthy to be here alone. This place, it holds too much history." It did, but not the kind they meant. It held the echoes of toddler footsteps, spilled cereal, and homemade Halloween costumes. It held the silence of late nights when Thomas worked late, and the sound of our laughter when he didn't. It held my entire life, and now I was being asked to condense it into 2 suitcases and a smile. Brian handed me an envelope before I got in the cab. Inside was $300 in cash and a sticky note with a number for a senior living facility circled in red ink. "For emergencies," he said, "until we sort through Dad's finances." As if my life had been a misplaced ledger entry, waiting to be tallied. The motel they dropped me off at was called the Golden Oak Inn, though there was nothing golden about it. The front desk smelled like burnt coffee and pine-scented disinfectant. The carpet My room was frayed near the door, and the walls were the color of canned peaches left too long in the sun. That first night, I sat on the bed, if you could call it that, and stared at the phone. I considered calling Gerald Thompson, our family's attorney, but something in me held back. Maybe shame, maybe disbelief, or maybe it was the stubborn voice of a woman who'd been underestimated her entire life whispering, "Not yet." Instead, I cried. Quiet, gasping sobs into a pillow that smelled like strangers. I cried for Thomas, for myself, for the home I had just lost. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, the grief began to crystallize into something sharper, something heavier, anger. The next morning, I walked 3 blocks to the diner on the corner and ordered black coffee and dry toast. I asked the waitress for the Wi-Fi password, borrowed a pen from behind the register, and scribbled notes on a napkin. Gerald's office number, the address downtown, bus routes, timetables, cash left, $242. At 11:17 a.m., I walked into Thompson and Price Legal Services, wearing the same cardigan and carrying my only decent handbag. Gerald looked up from his desk, his lined face softening into a mixture of surprise and concern. "Evelyn," he said, standing. "Thank God. I've been trying to reach you." I blinked. "You have?" "I called the house 3 times, he said. "Your son said you were traveling." "Traveling?" I smiled without warmth. He wasn't entirely wrong. I sat down across from him and set my bag on the floor. "Gerald," I said, "I need you to tell me exactly what's in Thomas's will. Not the summary, not the version Brian gave you. The truth." He paused, slowly opened a drawer and retrieved a thick manila folder. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" "No," I said, "but read it anyway." And just like that, the tide began to turn. Gerald's fingers moved with the precision of a man who'd done this 1,000 times, but I could see the tremble in them. He slid the will across the desk like it might explode. And in a way, it did. The last will and testament of Thomas William Carter, dated 7 months before his death, neatly typed, witnessed, notarized, ironclad. I, Thomas William Carter, being of sound mind and body. The words blurred for a moment, but I blinked the emotion away. I needed clarity, not sentiment. Gerald read aloud, "To my beloved wife, Evelyn Carter, I leave our primary residence at 14 Laurel Creek Lane, all furnishings, personal property therein, and 75% of all financial assets and investment holdings. I trust Evelyn to continue our legacy with dignity, grace, and sound judgment." I exhaled so hard I thought I might collapse. The house was mine. The money, most of it, was mine. I hadn't imagined the conversations we'd had, the gentle way Thomas had held my hands that winter evening and said, "You've always been the one to hold everything together. If anything happens, I want you taken care of." Gerald cleared his throat and continued, "To my son, Brian Carter, I leave the remaining 25% of financial assets to be held in trust until his 40th birthday, distribution contingent upon respectful treatment of his mother following my death." My eyes snapped to Gerald's face. "Contingent?" He nodded. Thomas was very clear. He didn't trust Brian's intentions, said he'd been worried about Samantha's influence, that they saw you as a stepping stone. A bitter laugh escaped me. "More like a welcome mat." Gerald leaned in, his voice lowering. "There was a will reading 3 days after the funeral. You weren't there." "No one told me," I said. "Brian said he'd handle everything, that it was all being sorted." Gerald's jaw clenched. "That's not just morally wrong, Evelyn. That's legally actionable. He misrepresented the contents of the will, told you the opposite of what it stated. That's fraud." My hands shook, not from fear, but fury. "I want everything frozen," I said. "Every account, every trust, every asset he thinks he has access to, today." "I can initiate the motions," Gerald said. "It'll take some time, but we'll block him out before he can drain anything." "Good. Do it. And Gerald?" "Yes?" "I want a forensic accountant and a private investigator. If he forged anything or tampered with any documents, I want to know. I want to know exactly how deep this betrayal runs." For a long beat, Gerald just looked at me, and then he smiled, not out of amusement, but respect. "You've changed," he said softly. "I'm not sure I've changed," I replied. "I think I just finally woke up." 2 hours later, I was sitting in a sunlit office across from a woman named Rebecca Granger, retired FBI, now one of the most respected private investigators in the state. Short white hair, no-nonsense demeanor, and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much to be easily surprised. "You want a full background on your son and his wife?" she asked. "I want to know if this was impulsive or planned," I said, "because something tells me this started long before the funeral." Rebecca leaned back in her chair. "You think they were counting down the clock?" I nodded. Samantha always asked about the house, the accounts. She knew Thomas was generous. She just didn't know he was also perceptive. Rebecca pulled out a tablet. "I'll start today. Bank transfers, email activity, business connections, social media. If they left a footprint, I'll find it." "Good," I said. "And Rebecca, I don't want pity, I want results." "You won't get pity from me, Mrs. Carter. You'll get the truth." That night, I checked into a new hotel, one with actual curtains and a mattress that didn't feel like a sack of potatoes. I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at the ceiling fan, watching it spin slow, steady circles. They had tried to erase me. Brian, the boy I had rocked to sleep through fevers, who cried into my arms when his college girlfriend broke his heart. Samantha, who once gifted me a Mother's Day card that said, "Thank you for raising the man I love." Had they ever meant a word of it? Or had the money always been the goal? My phone buzzed. Brian's name. I let it go to voicemail. Then I opened the voice memo app and hit record. "I, Evelyn Carter, am documenting every step of this process. If I go silent, if I disappear, if I'm pressured into anything, this story won't die with me." Because here's the thing about mothers like me. We may bend. We may compromise. We may choose peace over pride for decades. But once you back us into a corner and call us useless, you awaken something far more dangerous than you ever expected. You awaken a woman with nothing left to lose. And now I was ready to play the game they started. Only this time, I'd be the one holding all the pieces. The first time I saw my son's name in a digital forensic report, it felt like watching a stranger wearing his face. Brian Carter, age 38, investment advisor, married, 2 children, lives in a 5-bedroom colonial I helped pay the down payment on. That was the man I knew. The man in Rebecca Granger's report was someone else. "Take a look at this," Rebecca said, spinning her laptop toward me. Her screen was filled with transaction records, flagged bank statements, and private emails. This isn't just greed. This was coordinated, premeditated. The highlighted transfers told a story. 6 weeks before Thomas died, Brian began liquidating small accounts. Some in his name, some joint, some that had once been used to cover family vacations or home repairs. The amounts weren't enough to trigger red flags at first. $4,000 here, $6,500 there. But the pattern was unmistakable. "He was preparing for something," I murmured. Rebecca nodded. "Preparing to take over, and this—" She tapped another tab. "This is Samantha. She emailed a real estate agent 2 days after the funeral." I blinked. "To sell the house?" Number. "To inquire about its value, asking how quickly they could refinance if the deed was in their name." I felt something inside me go ice cold. My home had barely settled into silence after Thomas's passing, and my daughter-in-law was already picturing drapes and mortgage adjustments. And Brian? He had opened a new investment portfolio in both of their names labeled Post-Retirement Growth Strategy. I laughed, loud, harsh. Retirement? They were retiring me first. Rebecca didn't laugh. She just leaned back and said, "You ready to take this further?" I looked her straight in the eye. I want everything. Charges, freezes, public exposure. I want them to feel what it's like to be powerless. That afternoon, I met Gerald again in his office, this time accompanied by a man named Adam Keller, a former assistant U.S. attorney turned civil litigation specialist. "Your son and his wife have committed at least 3 crimes," Keller said bluntly. "Elder financial abuse, fraud, and will tampering. If they presented any alternate documentation to institutions, that's forgery and wire fraud." I stared at the glossy table between us, then lifted my chin. "We press charges, publicly." "Margaret," Gerald began gently. "No," I cut in. "Don't Margaret me. For years, I've let this family tell me what to do, what I could understand, what I didn't need to know. I may be 65, but I'm not senile. They made a decision. I'm making one too." Keller nodded. "We'll begin the process, but there's something else you should be aware of." He turned the page in the folder and laid out a stack of business filings, some with Thomas's name. "These aren't criminal, not directly, but they're irregular." I frowned. "Irregular how?" "Several of Thomas's companies received consulting payments from shell corporations, same addresses, same directors, and most of them are dissolved within a year." I felt my mouth go dry. "What are you saying?" "There's a chance," Keller said carefully, "that your husband was laundering money." "No," I said too quickly. "Thomas was a good man. He believed in earning things. He hated shortcuts." "Good men can get pulled into bad things," Gerald said softly. "Or," I said slowly, "he was protecting someone. Or hiding something bigger." That night, I stood in Thomas's study for the first time since I left the house. The space had been emptied by Brian and Samantha, redecorated, modernized, stripped of everything that made it his. But they'd missed the safe. Hidden behind the old paneling near the bookshelf was a wall, safe only Thomas and I knew about. He'd built it himself. I remembered standing behind him, handing him screws and whispering, "You're going to forget the code one day." He'd smiled and said, "Not this one. It's your birthday, backwards." I typed in 0619. The lock clicked. Inside were 2 stacks of folders, an external hard drive, and an old flip phone wrapped in rubber bands. I pulled everything out and spread it across the dining table. Receipts, wire transfers, names, account numbers, files labeled Client A and Client B, with initials that didn't belong to anyone I knew. One name stood out, Torino Investments. I typed it into Google. And that's when the room seemed to tilt. Torino Investments had been mentioned in a Senate hearing 5 years ago, suspected front for organized crime money laundering operations. I dropped the mouse. Thomas, number he couldn't be involved. But the evidence was there, laid out in neat manila folders like he had planned for someone to find it one day. My heart pounded. What had he gotten, involved in? And why had he never told me? The next morning, Rebecca returned. She took one look at the files and called a contact at the FBI. Within hours, I was sitting in a downtown field office being interviewed by Special Agent Sarah Martinez, a woman in her early 40s with calm intensity and sharp eyes that didn't miss a thing. "You're telling us your husband may have had knowledge of, or possibly cooperated with, known criminal financial networks?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "I found these yesterday." "And your son attempted to defraud you of your inheritance under false pretenses?" "Yes, using what he thought were forged versions of the will." Agent Martinez folded her hands. "Mrs. Carter, you may be sitting on the intersection of 2 federal investigations, one involving financial elder abuse, the other possibly connected to organized crime. I leaned back, exhaled, and closed my eyes. "My family thinks I'm weak," I said, "but I think they forgot something important." "What's that?" she asked. I opened my eyes and smiled. I remember everything. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be sitting in a federal field office with files connected to organized crime spread out in front of me like a buffet of sins, I would have laughed or cried, probably both. But there I was, Evelyn Carter, housewife turned whistleblower, staring into the sharp, analytical eyes of Agent Sarah Martinez, the woman who now held the keys to understanding the life my husband never told me about. "Mrs. Carter," she said, gently pushing one of the folders toward me, "we believe your husband was working as a confidential informant." I blinked. "What?" She nodded. "We've had eyes on the Torino network for over a decade. They operate under legitimate business fronts, consulting firms, shell corporations, high-end investment portfolios. Your husband's name showed up repeatedly, but never conclusively. We suspected he might be playing both sides. But now, with what you've brought us, we have reason to believe he was working with us. Deep cover, silent, feeding information. But he never said anything to me." Martinez offered a soft, understanding smile. "That's how it works. Informants at that level can't talk. Not to anyone, even spouses, especially spouses. It's about keeping everyone safe." I thought about the look in Thomas's eyes that last year, the weight behind his silences. I had attributed it to age, to stress, maybe even regret. But now I saw it for what it was. Secrecy wrapped in love. He'd protected me by keeping me in the dark. And when he died, he took the storm with him. Or so he thought. Martinez tapped the folder. "The funds he left you, at least most of them, were legally earned through his cooperation with our agency. The rest we'll trace. But the FBI has no intention of seizing what he rightfully earned helping us." I almost laughed. A bitter, shaking laugh that caught in my throat. "So, let me get this straight," I said. "My husband worked for the FBI. My son forged documents to steal my inheritance. And I've been living in a motel because everyone thought I was too old, too soft, and too stupid to notice any of it." Martinez's lips curved just slightly. "Not everyone, Mrs. Carter. Not anymore." The next move was mine. Rebecca and Gerald coordinated with the FBI to build a timeline that clearly laid out two parallel truths. Thomas Carter had spent the last decade working undercover for the government, and Brian Carter had spent the last month trying to destroy the one person Thomas had wanted to protect the most, me. But what Brian didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that I was no longer playing defense. I was going on the offensive. We set up the meeting at Gerald's office. Brian and Samantha arrived exactly on time, both dressed in polished business casual, trying too hard to look composed. Samantha wore an ivory blazer and heels that clicked like gunfire on the marble floor. Brian had that faux concerned son face on, the one he used at charity galas and mortgage closings. "Mom," he said, approaching with arms slightly outstretched, "you look better." I smiled. Grief does strange things. So does clarity. Gerald offered coffee. No one accepted. I didn't waste time. "I know everything," I said. Brian's smile faltered. "Everything?" "About the forged will, about the trust fund you tried to claim, about the house, about your plan to refinance a home that was never legally yours, about the fact that you told Gerald I was traveling during the reading when I was 3 miles away in a motel room you helped put me in." Samantha shifted. "Evelyn, We didn't mean I wasn't finished. Her mouth closed. Good. I continued. And now I know what your father was doing in those final years, who he was helping, and why he made sure you would never have access to that money without proving yourself worthy of it. Brian's face flushed. His mask cracked. Are you trying to destroy me? He said, voice low. No, I replied calmly. You're doing a fine job of that yourself. Gerald slid a folder across the table. These are the formal charges being filed: elder financial exploitation, fraud, attempted unlawful transfer of property, and obstruction. The FBI is also preparing a federal case. You'll be contacted within the week. Samantha stood. This is ridiculous. Brian didn't forge anything. I leaned forward. I have emails, voice memos, even recorded conversations where you both discuss the inheritance as if it were already yours. You left a digital trail wider than the Grand Canyon. Brian looked at me, and for a moment I saw the boy I once raised, the toddler who held my hand during storms, the teenager who snuck back home after curfew and whispered, "I love you, Mom," from the hallway. That boy was long gone. You can't do this, he whispered. I just did. When they left, I sat in Gerald's office in silence. He poured me a fresh cup of coffee and said nothing. He didn't have to. I had turned the first page of a new chapter. One written in my own hand, not as a grieving widow, not as a discarded mother, but as the executor of justice. Later that evening, I returned to my home. My home. I stepped into Thomas's study, the one Brian had tried to claim, tried to redesign, and I sat in his chair looking out the window, watching the golden light slip through the trees. There was more to uncover, more secrets Thomas had buried, but tonight I allowed myself a moment of peace. Outside, the wind stirred the branches like applause. And in the silence of that moment, I whispered aloud, not to anyone in the room, but to the man I had loved, mourned, and finally understood. You did good, Thomas. You protected me in your own quiet way. But now I'll handle the rest. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just change how you see other people. It changes how you see yourself. For most of my life, I was the woman who smiled politely, who made allowances, who held her tongue when she should have raised her voice. But in the weeks since I uncovered the truth about my husband, my son, and the quiet war being waged over my future, I'd begun to see my reflection differently, and I wasn't the only one. 2 days after Brian stormed out of Gerald's office, I received a visit. This time, it wasn't the police or the FBI. It was Marlene Carter, Thomas's estranged sister, a woman I hadn't seen in over 20 years. Marlene had always been a sharp dresser and a sharper tongue. She looked me over now like someone appraising a refurbished piece of furniture. "Evelyn," she said, stepping into my living room without waiting to be invited. "You've caused quite the stir." I raised an eyebrow. "Hello to you, too." She set her oversized purse on my coffee table and sat down as if this were a social call. "I assume you know why I'm here." I folded my arms. "If you're here on behalf of Brian, I hope you brought a lawyer." She waved a manicured hand. "Please. I came on behalf of myself. There are rumors circulating about Thomas's finances, about affiliations." I stared at her. "You mean the ones about him laundering money for organized crime while secretly working as a federal informant?" Her painted lips parted, not in shock, more like calculated interest. "So it's true?" I said nothing. She leaned forward. "Look, Evelyn, I don't care what Thomas was involved in. He and I never saw eye to eye. But if there's a scandal coming, and believe me, there will be, I need to protect the family name." That made me laugh. A raw, biting laugh. The family name? Marlene, I've been dragged out of my own home, lied to, robbed, and you want to talk to me about reputation. She blinked. Well, I can see you've changed. Yes, I said. I stopped asking permission to take up space. Marlene pursed her lips. There's going to be fallout, Evelyn. You've started something. The Carter name is going to be dragged through headlines, courtrooms, maybe even Congress. I suggest you think very carefully about the next move you make. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a whisper. I already did. That afternoon, I met with Agent Martinez again. You ready? She asked. I nodded. It was time to go public. Not for revenge, though that temptation simmered under the surface, but for power. Power reclaimed, power restored, and perhaps power wielded for those who didn't yet know they could rise. The media took to the story like wolves to a blood trail. Whistleblower widow uncovers family fraud and FBI secrets. From grief to justice, Evelyn Carter exposes high-level financial deceit. A mother's revenge, inside the legal war against her own son. The headlines were sensational. The interviews were relentless. And the public? They loved it. Elder advocacy groups reached out. Lawmakers scheduled calls. Netflix emailed Gerald's office requesting documentary rights. The Today Show offered a prime-time slot. And somewhere in the background, while the world watched me transform, Brian and Samantha's world crumbled. Their accounts were frozen, their assets seized. Samantha lost her job at the marketing firm. Brian's investment license was suspended pending criminal investigation. Even their friends stopped returning calls. But what hit them hardest wasn't the money. It was the loss of narrative. For years, they'd painted me as fragile, as traditional, as someone to be managed. Now I was the woman in the headlines, the woman in control. Still, the story was far from over. One evening, Agent Martinez called with new intel. Evelyn, she said, we've uncovered a secondary account, not Thomas's, Brian's. What kind of account? A private cryptocurrency wallet linked to a series of anonymous shell purchases. We believe he was preparing to flee. The word landed like a punch. Flee? Yes, passport application, travel documents, likely Canada, possibly Switzerland. He must have realized the case was closing in faster than expected. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter. Do you have him? We do now. Customs flagged him at the Toronto border 2 hours ago. He's in custody. I closed my eyes, let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. And Samantha? She was with him. We're bringing them both back under federal warrant. It was done. They had lost. Later that night, I walked through my house alone. There were no champagne toasts, no orchestra swell, just the quiet sound of my own footsteps echoing across hardwood floors I had polished by hand. In Thomas's old study, now mine, I lit a candle, not for memory, for clarity. Because with the case against Brian about to go to trial and the FBI quietly wrapping its final files on the Torino investigation, I knew the next chapter would be about more than justice. It would be about legacy, about what you build when everything you've known collapses and you choose not to bury yourself beneath the rubble. I looked at the blank canvas on my easel. It was time to start painting again. This time, in bold, unforgiving strokes. 3 months after Brian and Samantha were arrested at the Canadian border, my house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like mine. The wallpaper they picked was gone. The kitchen backsplash Samantha insisted on installing to modernize the space had been torn down and replaced with something quieter, something softer, something I chose. Legacy, it turns out, isn't built from what you leave behind. It's built from what you reclaim, and I was rebuilding everything. It started with a letter, not from Brian, not from Samantha, from Jenny, my granddaughter, 12 years old, too smart for her own good, too observant for the adults around her. "Dear Grandma," she wrote in neat, careful script, "Dad says I shouldn't write to you, but I want to. I saw you on the news. You looked strong. You look like a superhero. I want to be like you when I grow up. I miss you. Please write back." I stared at the paper for a long time before I realized I was crying, not because of pain, but because of hope. Agent Martinez and I spoke weekly now, not just about the case, but about the foundation we were building. The Evelyn Carter Foundation for Financial Justice would focus on helping elderly Americans navigate legal systems when betrayed by their own families. We were launching with a $5 million endowment, money pulled from clean funds Thomas had earned through his informant work. I refuse to build anything on tainted ground. "I want to make sure no one else ends up like I did," I told Martinez. "You didn't end up like anything," she replied. "You broke the cycle." Meanwhile, Brian and Samantha's trial approached. They faced multiple felony charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, elder financial abuse, forgery, attempted wire fraud, interference with a federal investigation. The evidence was airtight. They entered a plea bargain in exchange for reduced prison time, 18 months each in a federal correctional facility. No parole, no early release. They would serve every day. Some people said I should feel closure. Others asked if I felt guilty. But I didn't feel either. What I felt was clarity. A few days before sentencing, Gerald called. "I got a letter," he said, "from Samantha. Through her attorney. What does she want?" "She's asking for forgiveness." I laughed softly. "Is that all?" "She says she wants to protect the kids, that she's sorry, that she lost herself." I paused. I thought about Jenny's letter, about the other grandchild, Max, only 6 years old, innocent, oblivious. "Do they want me to testify for leniency?" "She didn't say it outright," Gerald replied, "but I think that's the hope." I looked out the window at the dogwood tree Thomas planted the year Brian was born. It had weathered storms, ice, heat, and still bloomed every spring, just like me. "I won't testify against them," I said, "but I won't save them either." "Understood." I hung up, heart quiet. Forgiveness is a gift, but not every thief deserves one. The day of sentencing, I didn't attend the courtroom. I went to a local middle school instead, where the foundation had partnered with a community program to teach students about financial literacy and fraud awareness. I spoke to 40 teenagers about power, money, and manipulation. One of them, a tall girl with nervous eyes, asked, "What do you do when your own family tries to hurt you?" I looked her straight in the eye. "You survive," I said. "Then you show them who you really are." That night, I finally answered Jenny's letter. "My dearest Jenny, thank you for your courage in writing to me. You are more like me than you know, brave, curious, and stronger than the world expects. When you're ready, we can talk. Not about blame, about truth, about how to break cycles instead of repeating them. I love you." Grandma later. I stood in the doorway of my art studio, formerly Thomas's study, now filled with sunlight, canvases, and scent of fresh oils. A new painting stood on the easel, a woman with silver hair and storm in her eyes. Her hands held both a sword and a gavel. Behind her, shattered glass, mended with gold. A version of me, not who I had been, who I had become. The morning of their release, I was already awake. The sun hadn't fully risen, but I could hear the house creaking softly, like an old friend shifting in its sleep. Today, Brian and Samantha would walk out of a federal facility 2 hours north of here. They'd served their time, 18 months just as the judge ordered. And while they were stepping out of prison, I was stepping into legacy. I didn't wait by the phone. I didn't check the news. Instead, I poured myself coffee into the ceramic mug I had used since Thomas and I bought this house in 1981, the one Brian had once called outdated. Then I sat in the breakfast nook I rebuilt, my space now, and reread Jenny's latest letter. Grandma, I'm reading books about women in history who changed the world. My teacher says courage skips a generation. I told her mine didn't. You taught me that. Love, Jenny. Sometimes the truest inheritance isn't money. It's the example you leave behind. By mid-morning, my assistant forwarded me a request. Samantha Hayes had scheduled a supervised visit to speak with me. She'd gone through the proper channels this time. No more manipulation, no more backdoor deals. Just a name, a date, and a request. I hesitated only a moment before replying, approved, 30 minutes, public location. We met at a quiet garden outside the local courthouse. Samantha looked smaller, not physically. She still wore her hair tied in a sleek knot, still carried that designer bag, but the edge was gone. The air of invincibility that had once made her untouchable had withered in the light of truth. Evelyn, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. Samantha. She sat across from me, hands folded. I waited. After a long silence, she spoke. I don't expect forgiveness. I said nothing. I need you to know, I lost more than money. I lost who I thought I was. I tilted my head slightly. Number you revealed who you were. She flinched, but didn't argue. I've started therapy, she added. Court-ordered, but it's helped. I'm trying to do better. For Jenny, for Max. At the mention of the children, my heart tugged. Not for her, but for them. For what they'd lived through, for what they'd one day learn. I'll speak to Jenny, I said, in my time, on my terms. Samantha nodded, swallowing emotion. That's all I could hope for. She stood to leave, then paused. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Turning us in? I looked at her. Really looked. The woman who had once handed me a $200 bill and told me to try the place on Maple Street. The one who'd called it mercy. No, I said. I regret waiting so long to stop being silent. Back at home, the foundation was growing. We had 4 offices across the state, partnerships with universities, and a hotline that received over 700 calls a week. People, mostly women, mostly elderly, finally had a place to turn when family turned into predators. The media had moved on, as it always does, but the ripples never stopped. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a private donor gala in New York. At first, I hesitated. Then I remembered the woman I had been in the motel room, folding my life into 2 suitcases. I went. As I walked onto the stage, the applause rose like a tide. And I spoke, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a woman who had learned that power doesn't come from control. It comes from reclaiming your voice. I used to think legacy was about what you leave behind, I said, but I've learned it's about who you lift while you're still here. Jenny graduates next spring. She wants to study law, says she wants to help People like you, Grandma." I smiled when I read that, because she doesn't want to be me. She wants to be better than me, and that's the greatest revenge of all. These days, I still paint. The last portrait I finished hangs above my fireplace. It's not of Thomas, not of Brian, not of myself. It's of a tree, twisted, weathered, split by lightning, but still standing. Its roots stretch deep into the soil, tangled and battered, but unshakable. Its branches reach upward, alive, defiant, still blooming. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.